Hello, I am Dr. Karen Jackson, and this short video will provide you with a basic introduction to your leadership ethics and decision making course, LEST 802. So, the goals of the presentation are to review some foundational theories for organizational theories, we want to look at some leadership theories that will provide kind of the context for our thinking with respect to ethical leadership. We will define some important terms. We need to have a common language as we delve into the readings that we'll be doing related to ethical leadership and decision making. So we'll look at some terms that will be a part of our common language. We'll look at some of the moral psychology for rule breaking and some of the things that leaders use to justify the breaking of rules. We'll look at an overview of complexity of decision making, and we would also consider some research questions and a discussion. So first off, this will look familiar to most of you if you've had our leadership theory course. It's the basic 4 quadrants of leadership. And the reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is because when we are thinking about ethics and decision making, we're thinking about the leader, right? But the leader is not the leader is only can be referred to in the context of who the leader is serving. So we need to think about ethics and leadership in the context of some type of framework for our leadership approaches. So the Bowman and Deal framework is one. There are many leadership theories, but this is one that kind of covers the gamut of things that we might think about when we think about the leadership, the ethics of a specific leader. So we have the political framework, the human resource framework, your structural framework, and then your symbolic. Mostly the reason I want you to think about this again is for context. When we're thinking about leadership behavior, it's usually in relation to either an individual, a group, either within an organization or outside of an organization. And then there are different things that come into play, right? So the leader makes individual decisions, but they're taking into consideration other things. They're thinking about the partnerships, what's what are the stakes, right? They're thinking about the organization itself. They might be thinking about the mission and vision of the organization. They might be thinking about some of the structural pieces of the organization, right? Resources. Where's the organization trying to go this year, next year, 5 years, 10 years? And there might be data that they're taking into consideration. And then, of course, there's cultural aspects. So anytime we're thinking about a leader's ethical behavior and how they make decisions, it should be in the context of a leadership theory. And like I said, I think this leadership theory provides us with a really good overall view of the types of things that leaders are dealing with in their day-to-day decision making. So next, I want to also think about the organization, and we have 2 frames here that that kind of give us a bird's eye view of the kinds of things we want to think about when we're thinking about organizations from a theoretical perspective. So the one on the left is another 4 quadrant system. And in the first quadrant, what you have is the me. So just the person that we're considering. In this case, it would be leaders of organizations. And what kinds of self-awareness do they have? What kinds of self-discipline and what kinds of self-direction, which are in direct alignment with when we're thinking about ethics and ethical behavior and ethical leadership. These tend to be the kinds of things that we go to. These are our go-tos. We want to know, what kinds of, when we see a leader that has done something that we want to call into question and we're questioning their ethics and their morals, we're wanting to know, well, what were they aware of? You know, why weren't they following the rules, right? What kinds of self-direction should they have been considering when they were making their decisions, right? In quadrant two, we have the we. So in the context of an organization, again, we've got more than just the leader. We've got who the people or the groups of people that the leader has power over. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the cohesiveness of the group, what kinds of collaborations are taking place, conversations, cooperations. These are all things that you want to think about when you are thinking about the behavior of a leader within the context of a situation. In the third quadrant, we have what's the shared identity. In some cases, a lot of this is similar to what we saw in the leadership development and deal leadership theory. We saw that there was a cultural piece. Again, here in organizations, we have the cultural piece, and what kinds of connections, communications, what kinds of things are shared meanings do people have across the organization, which helps us to understand what kinds of assumptions we can make, right, when we know these things. And then the fourth quadrant, we have the community, so partnerships, communities of practice, systems of meaning, and what types of interdependencies are there. So again, there's some of this is very similar to what we saw in the leadership theory by Bowman and Deal, and this just kind of adds to some of that by thinking about self-awareness and the group cohesiveness. Now, on the right, we have a transformation model. So typically when we're thinking about leadership organizations, we're thinking about how we make them better. So what this transformation model does is kind of shows you what some of your expectations might be when you're thinking about organizational change from a strategic perspective. So at the top, you've got, okay, there's going to be consequences for any actions. Some will be anticipated, some will be unanticipated, right? Same thing when we think about leadership behavior and actions. Some will be anticipated consequences and some we wouldn't have seen coming. And then you've got kind of three blocks down here. There's your organizational structure. There's any actions that take place using any of the organizational structures, which are policies and resources and routines. And then you've got what knowledge gets shared with what agents, right? As a result of the actions. And as you'll see, the knowledgeability and the actions go back and forth. The actions to the organizational structure goes back and forth, right? So we've got all of these things are working together in an organization. So again, I provide these foundational theories just to give us kind of some a place to start when we're thinking about specific cases and situations. Sorry, Onyx, he wants to also present tonight. And I might have to stop for a second and go put him up. But just remember that we're not talking about any behavior in isolation. Leaders don't just all of a sudden just do things that require us to pay attention to them. There's all kinds of things happening within organizations that are a part of why leaders make decisions that they make and why they behave the way that they behave. Now, we don't want to take away from the fact that each leader has it's their own person, right? Their own self that they are taking into consideration when they're making these decisions. But there's also these external factors that we have to also take into consideration. So I'm going to pause here. So next, I want us to look at some definitions of terms that we will be using consistently across the course. So of course, morals is a term that we'll be using, and this is the definition that we'll use, specific standards of right and wrong. It's from our Johnson text, and then we've got more about being than doing. So when we think about morals, we have general expectations or standards of what we believe is right or wrong. A lot of times it's defined by the organizational culture and expectations that have been set within the organization or within the community that we're considering. And The reason Price says that it's more about being than doing is because when we think about morals, we think about individuals' morals. We think about our own personal morals. We think about the personal morals of people that we know. And so it's how we exist or reside in the world and behave in the world that we're talking about when we talk about morals. Now, when we move to talking about ethics, it's more of the study of right and wrong behavior. So we take morals into consideration when we talk about ethics. And in most cases, what we're doing when we think about the ethics of a situation is we're making a judgment about based on what we consider morally right or wrong. We make a judgment about the ethics of a person when we are considering their behavior. Now, moral relativism is when we look at how is a leader justifying their behavior based on their own morals. So a leader's morals may not be the same as ours. So that's something to really take into consideration when we're looking at different readings and different assignments, when we're looking at different cases, because just because I believe something doesn't mean that the leader of my organization believes the same thing. And it's really important to have some level of understanding of what the morals of your leaders are. Think about organizations that you voluntarily um, become members of, right? You volunteer to become members of organizations that have leaders that you hope and believe have the same morals as you. And it's why we're so surprised when we see things like our church leaders fall from grace, right? Because we believe that church leader has similar morals to us. And we tend to hold them to a high moral standard. When we think about amoralism, we're thinking again about the justification leaders using in their rule-breaking behavior. But in this case, the leader doesn't care about morality. So I know that we can think of some really high-profile situations where we are wondering if the leaders are thinking about or care about morality. And where I go with this is I begin to ask different questions. So if they don't care about morality, they care about something, right? So if they're engaged in an organization or leading some community or government, they're there because they care about something, but it may not be moral. So when we think about amoralism, we have to begin to ask ourselves questions that are not about morality when we think about those leaders and their decisions. Now, the reason egoism, of course, is important is because, our ego, if we study psychology, has a lot of influence over our behavior. So in a lot of cases, leaders, if egoism is being practiced, leaders are making decisions about things just because they can, because they have the power, not because of anything that might be for the common good. Virtue ethics, another term that we want to have a common definition for, is the idea that the leader acts a certain way because the leader is special. So just because I'm the president of XYZ, I can act this way. This is another ethical situation that can become dangerous. And I'm sure, again, we can think of situations where leaders who were practicing virtue ethics led organizations or communities down the wrong road. Now, Kantian ethics is the one that that gives us the ability to look at leaders in their everyday behaviors and think about how they justify their behavior, but develop arguments to support the justification that they are not justified in breaking rules. So Kantian ethics gives us the ability to kind of look at multiple sides of a situation. And even though a leader might feel justified, it might even be able to provide some supporting evidence as to what they're thinking about when they're making decisions. But there are multiple sides to the story. And in some cases, depending upon which way you look at the story, there may not be legitimate justification for breaking the rules. And then finally, we want to agree as a class that leadership is the exercise of influence in a group context. So there are multiple definitions for leadership, but this is the basic definition that we'll use in this class for leadership. Now, the reason we need common frames and common definitions is because when we start to respond to research questions related to ethical leadership and decision making, we want to make sure that we're using that we're talking the same language. So if you say leadership or if you say ethics, we're saying the same thing. Now, if it doesn't mean that in your writing that you might not further define or more clearly define some of these words, I encourage you to, because there will be extensions to some of this as you proceed throughout the course and learn more. So this is just foundational, a place for us to start. So as we think about ethical leadership, I pulled out some quotes that I thought from your readings that I thought were would give us kind of a jumping off place to think about ethical leadership. So the first one comes from your Price text. The commonality is that both villainous and heroic leaders sometimes have to break, or at least think they have to break the rules to achieve their ends. Price goes on to talk about wartime, when leaders justify rule breaking because of things that are happening at war. And then there's also leaders who break unjust law. So the law, right? You shouldn't break the law. But if King is saying here, if the law is unjust, then there's some justification for breaking the law. Again, food for thought when we think about ethical leadership. The second quote I have here: when most people think about ethical leadership, they tend to imbue leadership with veils or a certain kind of moral character that we've witnessed in particular individuals. These associations are correct, but ethics and leadership are a lot like love and war. All is fair, but underneath their common employment lie a multitude of sins and methodological errors. So Fluker, we are looking at ethical leadership and decision making, and we're looking at research people have done on these areas. So he highlights the fact that there are two sides to this coin of ethical leadership, and that all is fair, right? But underneath, we don't know what lies underneath is what we're looking for, right? What are the things, like I started out talking about, the organizational factors, the leadership factors that lie under a decision or under a behavior, right? And then we also have to think about, because we're thinking about these from a perspective of research that social scientists have done, what type of methodological errors have taken place that are influencing how we see the results or the implications of a decision. And as you look more into processes for analyzing decision making, the methodological error piece should begin to make more sense. So another quote here from the Fluker text: leaders must be aware of the environmental realities in their inner environments that shape character, stability, and a sense of community. Now, your Fluker text, which most of the readings for Fluker are towards the end of the semester, but I encourage you to also, kind of dig into the text even when it's not a part of the assignment, because Fluker gives this character, stability, and sense of community with respect to leadership, ethical leadership. He helps to place things into context. So when you're looking at some of the case studies, like we'll look at one tonight, that's looking at a hospital in the midst of Hurricane Katrina. The context of the behaviors and the decisions that leaders are making in this emergent situation, there's character flaws, there's sense of community that was there, but it was broken because we are in an emergent situation. So the awareness of these environmental realities can be helpful, but it doesn't mean that the leader will make what we might consider the best decision. And there's implications for all of that. And then the final quote I have here from Johnson: the practice of ethical leadership is a two-part process involving personal, moral behavior, and moral influence. So again, like I said earlier, we're not ever going to take, when we're looking at a person's behavior and decisions and the implications, we're looking at the personal moral behavior and what moral influence their personal moral behavior has on the group or the community, right? So that's the core of what we're doing here. But we also don't want to leave out the fact that there's a larger environmental reality, as Fluker puts it, that shapes, right, the character, civility, and sense of community that the leader must also be aware of. So, justification for breaking rules and moral psychology. So I put a article into the resource folder that delves into the moral psychology of leadership. The title of the article is "The Psychology of Morality: A Review and Analysis of Empirical Studies," published in 1940 through 2017. What I've got on the slide here are some of the traits and characteristics of justification for rule breaking, and this comes from your Price text. But what I really want to get across here is that, again, morals are specific standards for right or wrong, and that moral principles indicate what is good, virtuous, just, right, and ethical with respect to human behavior. So, we say do no harm, right? Leaders' behavior should do no harm to the people that they're leading and or the people that they're leading, the influence that they have over the people that they're leading. And again, if we're talking about organizations or governments or communities, there's implications both inside as well as outside. So whoever the organization is serving, whoever the community is trying to care for, whoever the government is trying to govern, those leaders not only have an influence over the people inside the organization, but they also have influence over those that are outside of the organization. We want to keep in mind that when we think about human morality, it's rooted in the explicit self-awareness, so the autobiographical narratives that characterize human self-consciousness and the human's moral self-view of their morality. We know that there's the motivation for folks when they do fall from grace, right? So when they do break a rule that then has implications that maybe were unintended, we know that the individual as the leader is trying to trying to save the view of themselves, right? So while we hope that the individual is taking into consideration those that they are leading, we know that there's very heavily they're motivated to think about how people are viewing them. And so these are things that you have to take into consideration when we're thinking about the psychology, the moral psychology of leadership. So the terms here again are some of our foundational terms. We've got normatively differentiating, Leadership that functions with its own set of norms. So not norms that were maybe agreed upon by everybody, but just their own set. Instrumentalist leadership aims to achieve something that is valuable and worth achieving. There's the power conferring, so that this is because leadership is a relationship between people. Leaders are able to exercise power over others in ways that make it possible for leaders to get away with doing what others cannot do. Are they special? This is what it depends on traits. The definition of depends on traits. So it's assumption that unlike the rest of us, the leader acts as they do because they're special. Depends on the differences between leaders and followers. Now, both power conferring and depends on traits kind of fall flat in the light of how some people are asking us to think about leadership and ethical leadership, because the definition for leadership has become more broad. And that's one of the other reasons I wanted us to be clear about what we meant by leadership. In the definition that we're using for this class, is that there's some influence over a group. So a lot of times we want, oh, well, everybody's a leader. Everybody has leadership characteristics. And this could be true. But for the purposes of this class, we want to make sure that we're thinking about people who have influence over a group. Another characteristic that we want to take into consideration when we're thinking about the moral psychology of leadership is consensual. So the leaders, sometimes leaders do things because the followers are okay with it and are supportive of it, and may even be pushing them to act the way they do. Responsive to necessity. The leader acts the way they do because it was unavoidable, right? Another way that someone might justify their behavior. There was no way around it. Especially in emergent situations, we might find leaders using this approach to justifying their behavior. Another approach to justifying behavior is necessarily partial. So, meaning it's partial to putting the goals of the group ahead of the others. So it's necessary to do this because something would have happened to the group if I had not done it, which is juxtaposed against significantly impartial, where the exception serves society as a whole or as a common good. So it's not just about maybe the group within the organization or a small group in the community, but it serves a higher purpose. Now, it's not to say that these are the only justifications, but these are some well-researched and common justifications for breaking rules, but it doesn't mean that there aren't others that you will probably come across in your readings. Now, the decision-making piece, and we are using the framing from a text that's not really one of your required texts, but you're welcome to get the text if you want. But any readings from that text, I will provide copies of. There are at least two kind of buckets of things you need to think about when we're thinking about decision making. So you need to think about the complexity of this decision, and then you also need to think about, well, how will I analyze that decision? Or how might the leader analyze, what might the leader analyze in making a decision? So in thinking about the complexity of a decision, if you just think about when we get up in the morning and we have to get ready for work, there are multiple things that we have to consider when we're deciding what to do and when to do what, right? So we've got to get up. There might be other people in the house, children that we have to make sure they're up. There might be multiple stops on your way to work. And so you have to decide, which ones should come first and which should come second. There might be something that might come up. Maybe there was something that a kid needed to take to school and somebody forgot to get it. So today we might be taking a different route, right? So there's all these different objectives that you have to think about And then there's the uncertainty involved. So we don't know what else is going to be happening on the road when we get ready to go to take the kids to school and to go to work, right? So there's this level of uncertainty. And then there's also the decision maker's attitude about risk, right? So some people are risk averse, and then some people are have high levels of risk taking. So, you know, if you have to be somewhere at 8 and it takes an hour to make all of your stops, and in order for you to be there at 8, then someone with a high level of risk might to leave the house at 7, which gives them exactly an hour. So if any of the uncertain situations happen, it means they're going to be late. But someone who doesn't have, who is less, who is risk averse, they might leave the house at 6:15 just to give themselves enough time to make all the stops, to take it into to factor in all the uncertainties, right? So again, we're just stepping through the complexity of making a decision right now about what time to leave for work, right? And just think about, when we're thinking about ethical leadership, we're thinking about decisions that are much bigger in some cases than what time to leave for work. Just in thinking about leaving for work, you can see the complexity, that there are some things that will be sequential in the decision making, but some things might not be sequential, and that there are multiple stakeholders. So you have to consider the complexity of the decision. And then the second part of this is analyzing the decision. So the steps in thinking about how do we analyze a decision. Rarely are we only analyzing the decision to leave the house at 7 or to leave the house at 6:15. We're also analyzing all the other smaller decisions that have taken place to helping you get to the decision to leave early or not early, right? So that's what we're talking about, doing a partial decision analysis, thinking about all the many decisions that took place before the final decision. We want to also take into consideration that in order to make a decision, you have to be aware of yourself as well as other things. And you also have to commit to making the decision. I don't know if anybody knows anybody that has a real hard time making decisions. I've got a really good friend in my head right now who, anytime we think about where do we want to go eat, she never can make a decision about where. Never. In, like, I don't know, 17 years, she's never been able to make a decision. So commitment is commitment phobia is a thing. Committing to a decision. So sometimes in organizations we wonder, well, why isn't something happening? There could be something going on with respect to committing to making a decision. And sometimes that paralysis comes because there are so many partial decisions that have to take place to get to the final decision. And if there's no accountability, then the decision might never get made. And of course, we want to assume that people are making rational decisions. And we have to ask ourselves, is that assumption rational? So again, these are just things to think about foundationally as we're thinking about ethical leadership and decision making. And when we're thinking about the decisions that leaders are making and judging whether they were ethical or not, these are the things, the complexity and the analysis process that we need to think through. So for your next discussion, I'm going to have you think about Memorial Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana. There's a show right now that's on Apple TV that's called 5 Days at Memorial. There are clips for the show that you can watch on YouTube, and I would like for you to take a look at a clip for day 4 of the series. And I want you to think about some things that are happening in the day 4 situation that stand out to you as an issue of ethical leadership and decision making. And I just want you to do a little discussion of it in light of some of these foundational things that you looked at on this video. So from the point of view of leadership theory, organization theory, from the point of view of some of the justifications that leaders use for making decisions, and from the point of view of the complexity of decision making. What you'll find in day 4, some of the issues and challenges are around environment and resources. So if you remember Hurricane Katrina, which was back in 2005, New Orleans was flooded the day after Hurricane Katrina hit because of the levees breaking. And so that caused many situations, but one at Memorial Hospital, which is one of the largest hospitals in the city, it was surrounded with water. They didn't have any electricity and no air conditioning in New Orleans in August. It's over 100 degrees. And people are sick. People are on ventilators. So think about that situation, right? And the types of decisions that the leaders in this situation had to make. Think about the capacity of the organization. What you'll find when you see the clip is that there were 2 entities within the building. So Memorial Hospital was one entity, and then Life Care, which they had patients who needed extended care. So Life Care was another organization which was housed within the hospital. And the communications between the 2 were basically non-existent. So think about the situation where you've got 2 organizations within one building in an emergent situation where there's no water, no electricity, no air conditioning, and you can't get out. Local, state, and federal authorities' capacities, it was, you'll see it was a lot more than about their capacity. Their response to things was raises multiple ethical and moral questions. And then the last challenge or issue that I want you to pay attention to is the community, right? So there's a community inside the hospital. There are multiple communities inside the hospital because there's the leadership. There are those that are taking care of patients, so the doctors and nurses. And then you've got the patients, you've got the patients' families, and then you've also got people who fled to the hospital who weren't patients' families, but they just came to the hospital as a place of safety. So you've got all those people in the building, and then you've got people outside the hospital who want to get in. And you're in a life and death situation, multiple life and death situations, and there's broken communications as well as other broken systems. So lots to think about. I encourage you, if you have access to Apple TV, to watch the whole series because it's pretty fascinating. And even if not, I'd like for you to watch the clips from day 4. And there's also an article, which you'll be able to click on the link in the PowerPoint to go to the article. And that will, if you only have access to the video and the article, that's sufficient for you to participate in the discussion. So lastly, I would, this being a PhD program, we do need to think about research questions because that's what we're here for. So some of the basic research questions that come out of an introduction to ethical leadership and decision making, I've listed here. I'm sure there are others that you can think of as you begin to learn more about ethical leadership and decision making through the cases we'll look at. The first one I have here is, how did the categorization of leadership behavior help us to understand the psychological and sociological factors of morality and ethics in leadership? Now, that's a really big question that could likely be broken out. But I think that's a very good starting place, because when we think about the categorization of leadership behavior, we start with the definition of leadership. We begin to look at how leaders are behaving and responding in certain situations, which some of our justifications give us some framing there. And then how does that help us understand the psychological and sociological factors? So that's something to think about. How do we understand our reasoning, or our process for determining when leaders are morally justified in doing what others are not allowed to do? So there's ethical decision making, but there's also the decision making of those of us in the group are those that are being led in our own personal understanding of the justification. And when we are a part of the group, and if we're in a situation where we are promoting or allowing leaders to do certain things, what's our own process and reasoning, right? The third one I have here is, can morality reign in the behavior of everyday leaders if it fails to generate reasons for people who do not or are do not care enough about morality? I need to reword that question. So basically, if a leader doesn't care about morality, how do you rein in the behavior of the leader if they don't care? What is the relationship between spirituality, social transformation, and ethical leadership? Now, we can't talk about morals without thinking about individual spirituality. Whether a person is religious or not is not what I'm talking about. We're talking about how people think about the self that we can't touch, our intangible selves. So what is the relationship between spirituality and change and ethical leadership? And I'm sure there's multiple ways to look at that question. What is meant by the term good leader? Someone that's a good leader from my perspective might not be a good leader from your perspective, and vice versa. So what do we mean when we say good leader? If all leaders are not good, and if a position is not the defining variable of leadership, so meaning being a president or being, someone with a leadership role, then what is or are the defining variables for good leader? If it's not position, and if it's not being a good leader, what are the defining variables? And then lastly, are ethics and effectiveness compatible? So basically, if I say that you are behaving appropriately and your ethics are good, does that mean that you'll be an effective leader? Or can someone that has bad ethical behavior also be effective? All questions that are food for thought, questions that I hope you will continue to consider as you learn more, read more, delve more into ethical leadership and decision making. I hope these questions make you curious. Feel free to add to the questions in the discussion. And I just look forward to working with you all across the semester. Please reach out if you have questions. You know when my office hours are. And if you need to talk with me outside of office hours, please just send me an email. We'll find another common time. And until the next presentation, take care.